In this lesson, we're going to discuss the chain of command in corporations. Most nonprofit organizations, but not all of them, are corporations. Corporation law is a matter of state law, and it does vary among the states, but there are some general principles that transcend most state statutes. So the principles we talk about here are generally true in all states, but there can be some exceptions, and you want to check the statutes of the state, both where you are incorporated, if it is a corporation, and where you operate, as there can be some impact there as well. As a general matter, the chain of command in a corporation is that the board is at top. The board is the corporation to a great extent. And underneath the board come the officers. Those that are mostly mandated are president, secretary, and treasurer, although those titles can change dramatically. For example, you can have a director of finance rather than a treasurer. Um, you can have a chief executive rather than a president, or an executive director rather than president. But underneath the officers come all the other agents, which include employees and volunteers, anybody else that is retained to carry out a specific purpose. This chain of command is important. The most significant part that is lost on some people is that the board is at the top of the heap. The chief executive is accountable to the board. The board has ultimate responsibility for everything that happens in the organization. They are the last word. So the president and the other officers are accountable to the board. And this is often neglected because boards meet so seldom, they don't know what's going on a day-to-day basis. How can they be in charge? But it is actually because of the fact that boards can't be operating at all times that it's necessary to have officers. Because a board consists of a number of people and the individuals don't have any authority as just being directors, the board only is in power when it is in session. When they gather together, either in person or online or by telephone, the gavel comes down, a metaphorical gavel. They are in session. They make all the decisions that are binding upon the corporation. But because they can only operate when they're in session, there's a lot that they cannot do. They can't sign contracts that are going to be entered into when the board is not in session. This is why officers are important. Officers carry out all of the day-to-day functions while the board is not in session. That's the way that it should be. It works very, very well. But it is important to bear in mind that even though the president or chief executive officer may have tremendous influence on the organization because he or she really knows what is going on, where the board is dependent upon that officer to get a lot of data, it is actually the board that is responsible at the end of the day for what happens in the organization. They're the ones that have the principal concern about carrying out the safe strategy, safety, and audit functions that we talked about in our first lesson. It is also important to realize that individual directors on the board, just as directors, have no authority at all. They are just a part of the board. Once the board is in session, they have a vote that is the equivalent of the vote of all others on the board, but in the role of just being the director, they don't have any authority at all. One kind of minor exception is the chair of the board may have some responsibility for determining what the board does when it's in session, simply because that's a task that is given to that individual in that capacity. But as the chair of the board, even the chair is only functioning formally when the board is in session. So this line of authority should be kept in mind. The board is the last word on everything. The president and other officers are accountable to the board, and then all others, be the employees or volunteers, any other agents, are accountable up the chain of command. When speaking of the officers, there can be any number of officers, and depending how complicated the organization is, there can be a number of officers that other organizations wouldn't necessarily have. But I do want to draw attention to one particular officer role, the one that has the most specific authority that's often misunderstood in a lot of the the navigation of board issues, and that is that the secretary, under state law in most states, has the ability to certify that documents that are managed, generated, or used by a corporation are the actual binding ones. That if the secretary certifies that this document is true, then that can be binding on the organization. An example of that would be a directive from the organization that a bank should allow somebody to be added as a signatory. If that direction is certified by the secretary, banks in many states can rely upon that as being true. That's actually a power the secretary has that the president doesn't necessarily have unless that authority is granted by the bylaws or by direction by the board that's reflected in minutes. And it is because of this that we like to point out how the secretarial role is often misunderstood. People tend to think of the secretary as that person who takes minutes, but there is no statutory mandate that secretaries be the ones who take minutes. There's no real word for that other than the minute taker, or you could casually call it the secretary of the meeting. But the role of the secretary is primarily that of having control and management of the documents and records of the organization. We pose with our clients as the ideal secretary to have for an organization is that person to whom, if you asked, can I get a copy of the liability insurance policy from 10 years ago? That person can say, give me 10 minutes and I'll go get it for you. That person who's got that kind of capacity to access the records of the organization is ideally suited for secretary. The reason why this is important is that many organizations, not realizing the significance of that, will pick as the secretary somebody who's on the board. And often that's not somebody who's eager and enthusiastic to do it, but it's somebody that is ultimately going to take the minutes. But being the minute taker does not mean that you've got the ability to competently certify documents. So our recommendation is don't necessarily draw your secretary from the board. Rather, draw it from the person in the organization that has the access and knowledge of where all the records are kept and can respond in that way. But with that, you have the line of authority. Board is on top. Officers are accountable to the board. All other agents are accountable to either the board, if there's a direct authority line given to them, or to the officers. And individual directors don't have any authority when they are in their individual capacity, but tremendous authority when they're part of the board when it's in session.